"You ever notice," the old man said quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line, "that the people most eager to prove they're in control are usually the least certain they are?" The words drifted into the warm afternoon air, just as Cadet Nathan Reed tightened his grip on the blue training pistol and leveled it toward the elderly stranger's head. Around them, the Marine Corps officer candidate training grounds buzzed with activity. Boots pounded packed dirt. Instructors barked commands from across the field. The American flag snapped sharply in a steady 12-mile-per-hour breeze. Yet inside the small circle forming around the confrontation, everything seemed to slow. Nathan was 21 years old, standing 6 feet tall in a spotless utility uniform that still carried the crisp confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. He had spent the last 10 minutes convinced he was handling a security threat. The old man had wandered through a restricted training lane without hesitation, ignoring warning signs and bypassing areas clearly marked for cadet exercises. To Nathan, the situation seemed simple. To everyone watching, it looked increasingly strange. The old man stood motionless. His faded green field jacket hung loosely from narrow shoulders. His gray hair stirred gently in the wind. Deep lines crossed his weathered face, but there was nothing fragile about him. More unsettling was what he did not do. He did not argue. He did not explain himself. He did not appear nervous. Most civilians would have been stumbling through apologies by now. Most would have been demanding answers. This man simply stood there as if he had all the time in the world. "Sir," Nathan said sharply, forcing authority into his voice, "I'm giving you a direct order. Identify yourself immediately." The old man slowly turned his head toward him. His pale blue eyes were clear, calm, focused. They settled on Nathan with the same casual attention a grandfather might give a restless child. "That's the problem with direct orders," he replied. "Too many people give them before they understand the situation." Several cadets exchanged uneasy glances. Nathan felt irritation rising in his chest. The stranger's composure made no sense. It challenged the invisible script Nathan expected everyone to follow. "You think this is funny?" Nathan demanded. "No, son," the old man answered. "Not even a little." A gust of wind swept across the training field, carrying dust and the distant hum of helicopters from another part of the base. Somewhere behind the crowd, a senior instructor paused mid-conversation and looked toward the scene. Nathan noticed none of it. His attention remained locked on the stranger. "Last chance," he said. "Name." The old man studied him for several seconds. Then something that looked almost like sadness crossed his face. Not fear, not concern, sadness. "Thomas Walker," he said at last. The name meant nothing to Nathan, nothing to the cadets, nothing to anyone standing nearby. And yet the old man spoke it with the quiet certainty of someone who knew it should have meant something. Then he added 4 words that would soon change everything. "You're making a mistake." For several long seconds, nobody moved. The wind continued pushing across the training grounds, rattling the canvas walls of nearby temporary shelters and sending loose dust skimming over the packed earth. Thomas Walker stood exactly where he was, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unchanged. Around him, the circle of cadets grew larger. Training had slowed. Curiosity was spreading. Nathan Reed lowered the training pistol slightly, not because he trusted the old man, but because something about him felt impossible to categorize. Civilians usually filled silence with explanations. They argued. They defended themselves. Thomas did none of those things. He simply waited. The stillness was beginning to irritate Nathan more than open resistance ever could. "Search his belongings," Nathan ordered. One of the cadets stepped forward and carefully picked up the worn canvas bag resting near Thomas's boots. The bag looked older than some of the people standing there. Sun-faded, frayed at the edges, heavy from decades of use. "You carry this thing through a war or something?" Another cadet joked. A few nervous laughs followed. Thomas did not answer. The zipper opened with a rough metallic sound. The cadet began pulling items into view one at a time. A folded rain poncho, a small flashlight scratched by years of use, a stainless steel canteen with faded lettering nearly rubbed away by time. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Nathan folded his arms. "See? Probably just some confused old guy." Then the cadet reached deeper into the bag. What is this?" He held up a small weathered notebook. The cover was cracked. The corners were rounded smooth from years of handling. Nathan took it and flipped it open. Most of the pages were blank. Others contained notes written in careful block letters. Dates, coordinates, names. Nothing that immediately made sense. Then he reached the inside cover. For words were written there in dark blue ink. If found, call Kane. Nathan stared at the message. Kane? Another cadet asked. Who is Kane? No idea, Nathan replied. Probably his grandson. More laughter. Yet this time it sounded forced. The notebook did not feel ordinary. Neither did the old man watching them. Thomas remained silent, but his eyes followed the notebook with quiet attention. Not worry, not fear, more like recognition, as if he had seen this exact moment coming. Nathan closed the notebook and held it up. You want to explain this? Thomas looked at the faded cover. No, the answer caught everyone off guard. No, Nathan repeated. That is your response. You asked if I wanted to explain it. Thomas's voice remained calm. I do not. A few cadets exchanged glances. One actually smiled despite himself. Nathan felt his patience slipping. Every answer from the old man seemed to make him less certain. Not because the answers were threatening, because they were not. They carried no urgency at all. It was as if Thomas Walker was operating from information nobody else possessed. Somewhere beyond the crowd, an instructor paused and continued watching. Then another. The atmosphere was changing. Slowly, almost invisibly, like pressure building before a storm. Nathan looked down at the notebook once more. For simple words. If found, call Kane. He had never heard the name before. Yet for reasons he could not explain, the message left a strange weight in his chest. And for the first time since the confrontation began, he found himself wondering whether Thomas Walker had been right. Maybe they really were making a mistake. The uneasiness spread through the training lane like a shadow crossing open ground. Nobody could quite explain it. Nothing dramatic had happened. No alarms had sounded. No senior officers had arrived. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The cadets felt it. The instructors watching from a distance felt it. Even Nathan Reed felt it, though he refused to admit it to himself. He tucked the notebook under his arm and stepped closer to Thomas Walker. The old veteran stood quietly beneath the afternoon sun, his faded field jacket moving slightly in the breeze. The training grounds stretched behind him for hundreds of yards. Obstacle courses, marksmanship ranges, temporary structures built for leadership exercises. Young men and women trained there every day to become future Marine officers. Yet somehow the oldest person present looked the most comfortable. Nathan studied him carefully. The gray hair, the weathered face, the calm eyes. Nothing about him looked impressive. Nothing about him looked dangerous. And still, the feeling remained. Who are you really? Nathan asked. Thomas looked toward the distant tree line. For several seconds he did not answer. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally he spoke. Nobody important. A few cadets laughed. The response sounded ridiculous. Yet Thomas delivered it without sarcasm, without bitterness, without even a hint of humor. Nathan shook his head. People who are nobody do not carry notebooks with mysterious names inside. Thomas gave the smallest shrug. Everybody is mysterious if you know little enough about them. The answer only deepened Nathan's frustration. Every conversation felt like trying to grab smoke. Before he could respond, another cadet approached carrying several loose papers from the canvas bag. Found these. Nathan took them. Most appeared to be old photographs. Faded. Worn. Some were so sun-bleached they were difficult to make out. One showed several young Marines standing beside a helicopter somewhere decades earlier. Another showed a group sitting together near tents under heavy rain. Faces were younger. Uniforms were older. Time had erased many of the details. Nathan flipped through them quickly. Then he stopped. One photograph caught his attention. The image showed a group of Marines standing in formation. Near the center was a young man whose face looked strangely familiar. Nathan frowned and held it closer. The jawline, the eyes, the expression. It looked remarkably similar to Thomas Walker. Not identical, but close enough to make him pause. This you? Nathan asked. Thomas glanced at the photograph. For the first time since the confrontation began, something changed in his expression. It lasted less than a second. A flicker, a memory passing behind his eyes. Long time ago, he said quietly. Nathan examined the photograph again. There was no name written on it. No date. No explanation. Just a young Marine standing among others who had likely been gone for decades. The breeze lifted one corner of the paper. Thomas continued staring at it. Suddenly, the noise of the training grounds seemed farther away. The cadets noticed it too. The old man was no longer just an unidentified stranger. He was becoming a question nobody could answer. And questions had a way of growing larger the longer they remained unanswered. From the edge of the field, a gunnery sergeant named Mason Burke had been observing everything. He had said nothing so far, had not intervened, had not approached, but now his attention narrowed on the photograph in Nathan's hands. Something about it made him stop walking. Something about the young Marine standing in the center stirred a memory he could not immediately place. Burke stared for several long seconds. Then his expression slowly changed. Not recognition. Not yet. But close. The training field continued operating around them, but the confrontation had become its own gravity well, pulling attention from every direction. Gunnery Sergeant Mason Burke started walking toward the gathering crowd with slow, deliberate steps. 20 years in the Marine Corps had taught him to trust instincts long before facts arrived, and something about Thomas Walker was setting off alarms that had nothing to do with security. Nathan Reed noticed the senior non-commissioned officer approaching and straightened immediately. "Gunny," he called. "We have the situation under control." Burke did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the old photograph still resting in Nathan's hand. The image fluttered slightly in the afternoon breeze. Dust rolled across the ground in thin waves. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed overhead, its faint rotor noise drifting across the base like distant thunder. Burke stopped beside Nathan and extended his hand. "Let me see that." Nathan hesitated for only a moment before passing over the photograph. Burke studied it carefully. The faces were faded. The edges were worn nearly white. Time had erased most of the details. Most, not all. His eyes settled on the young Marine standing near the center. Then he looked up at Thomas. Back to the photograph. Then back again. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Decades separated the two faces, but the eyes were the same. Calm, watchful, unmoving. "Where did you get this?" Burke asked quietly. "It was in his bag," Nathan replied. Burke nodded. Thomas remained silent. The old veteran seemed completely unconcerned by the growing attention. That bothered Burke more than anything. Most people reacted when authority focused on them. Thomas seemed entirely unaffected. Burke continued examining the photograph until he noticed something near the lower corner. A small shape barely visible through years of fading. It looked like part of a rifle stock resting against the young Marine's leg. The stock carried a distinctive scar. A deep gouge cut through the wood at an angle. Burke froze. His eyes narrowed. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. Then memory surfaced. Years earlier, he had visited the National Museum of the Marine Corps during a leadership course. One exhibit had featured a famous reconnaissance rifle preserved behind glass. The plaque had described a combat patrol whose details remained largely classified even decades later. What Burke remembered most was the photograph displayed beside the weapon. Not because of the rifle itself, because of the unusual gouge carved into the stock. The exact same mark. A chill moved through him despite the warm Virginia afternoon. He looked at Thomas again. The old veteran met his gaze without saying a word. Suddenly Burke felt as though he were standing near a piece of history that nobody else recognized. Nathan noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Burke lowered the photograph slowly. "I am not sure." It was the most honest answer he could give. Because certainty had not arrived yet. But suspicion had. Strong suspicion. The kind that grows from tiny details. The kind that changes everything. And for the first time that day, Burke found himself wondering whether the quiet old man standing before them was not lost at all. Maybe he was exactly where he intended to be. Burke could not take his eyes off the photograph. The longer he studied it, the stronger the feeling became. Small details that should have meant nothing were beginning to align in ways he did not like. The worn rifle. The faded faces. The unmistakable gouge carved into the stock. He looked up at Thomas Walker once more. The old veteran stood beneath the afternoon sun with the same quiet patience he had displayed from the beginning. Around them, the crowd had grown larger. Cadets whispered among themselves. Instructors lingered nearby, pretending to supervise training while watching every second of the unfolding scene. Nathan Reed crossed his arms. "Gunny, are you saying you know who he is?" Burke took a slow breath. "No," then he paused. "I am saying I think I should." The answer only deepened the mystery. Nathan glanced toward Thomas. Then maybe he should start explaining. Thomas offered the faintest smile. It was not mocking. It was not proud. It was the expression of a man who had lived long enough to recognize that explanations rarely changed minds. People hear what they are ready to hear, he said quietly. The words drifted through the warm air. Burke looked down again at the photograph. This time his attention settled on a handwritten date barely visible near the bottom edge. The ink had faded almost completely. He narrowed his eyes and read the numbers. His pulse quickened. The date corresponded to an operation he vaguely remembered from a leadership seminar years ago. Not because the mission itself was famous, because almost nobody knew the full story. The operation had taken place decades earlier in a remote region where a small reconnaissance team became isolated far from support. Official records remained heavily restricted. Most Marines only knew fragments. Yet one detail had survived through generations of storytelling. A young reconnaissance Marine had guided his team through impossible conditions and brought every surviving member home. The man's name had rarely appeared in public records. Some stories claimed the reports had been sealed. Others claimed the details were intentionally removed. Over time, the man became less a person and more a legend passed quietly between Marines. Burke remembered instructors mentioning him only once. A ghost from another era. A name spoken with respect. Nothing more. The wind shifted across the training field. For an instant, Thomas's jacket opened slightly. Burke noticed a small embroidered patch sewn inside the lining. It was old. Extremely old. Most people would never have recognized it. But Burke had spent enough years studying Marine Corps history to know what he was looking at. His breath caught. The patch matched a reconnaissance insignia retired long before any cadet standing there had been born. Suddenly the photograph, the rifle, the notebook, and the old man's silence no longer felt disconnected. They felt connected in ways that made Burke increasingly uncomfortable. He looked at Thomas. "Where did you get that patch?" Thomas glanced down briefly. "A friend gave it to me. A long time ago." Thomas nodded. "A very long time ago." Burke felt a chill despite the heat. Because deep inside, a possibility was beginning to form. A possibility he was not ready to say aloud. Not yet. But if he was right, the crowd standing around Thomas Walker was no longer dealing with a confused old visitor. They were standing face to face with someone whose story had been quietly traveling through Marine Corps history for decades. The realization refused to leave Mason Burke alone. He had spent years teaching young Marines that details mattered, that history mattered, that small clues often revealed larger truths. Now those lessons were staring back at him through the form of an 82-year-old man standing quietly in the middle of a training field. Nathan Reed sensed the change in the gunnery sergeant's demeanor. "Gunny, what is going on?" he asked. Burke did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a phone from his pocket and stepped several feet away from the crowd. The movement alone drew attention. Senior non-commissioned officers did not make private calls during training exercises unless something required immediate attention. The afternoon sun hung low over the base, casting long shadows across the dirt lanes and obstacle courses. A steady breeze carried the scent of pine trees from the edge of the installation. Burke opened a secure personnel database and began entering information. Thomas Walker. The name produced hundreds of results. Too many. He narrowed the search using age estimates and service history clues. Nothing appeared. He tried again. Still nothing. That should have reassured him. Instead, it made him more concerned. Records disappeared for reasons. Some were lost. Some were classified. Some belonged to people whose stories never fully entered the public system. Burke glanced toward Thomas. The old veteran stood exactly where he had been standing for nearly an hour. Patient. Silent. Unbothered. Nathan and the cadets remained nearby, their earlier confidence fading with every passing minute. Burke opened another database available only to senior personnel. This time he entered a different search term. The retired reconnaissance insignia. The date from the photograph. The results appeared instantly. His stomach tightened. A heavily restricted historical reference populated the screen. Most of the document was unavailable. Entire sections were blacked out. Names were removed. Locations were omitted. Yet one sentence remained visible. It described a reconnaissance team whose actions had influenced operations far beyond their size. Beneath that summary appeared a note. Personnel records archived under special authority. Access restricted. Contact Headquarters Marine Corps Historical Division. Burke stared at the screen. Then his eyes moved lower. A reference number appeared beside the archive notice. He recognized it immediately. It was not a normal classification marker. It was the type reserved for individuals whose operational histories remained sensitive decades later. Burke slowly exhaled. Nearby, Nathan watched him with growing unease. "Gunny." Burke looked up. "Cadet Reed." "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant." "Do not question Mr. Walker any further." The words landed like stones. Several cadets exchanged nervous looks. Nathan blinked. "Sir, that was not a suggestion." Burke's tone remained calm, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Nathan glanced toward Thomas, who seemed entirely unsurprised by the exchange. "You found something?" Nathan asked quietly. Burke looked at the old veteran for a long moment. "I found enough to know we need somebody much higher than me involved." The wind lifted dust across the training field once more. Far above, a transport aircraft crossed the blue Virginia sky. Thomas followed it briefly with his eyes before returning his attention to the horizon. Burke opened his contacts and selected a number very few Marines ever used. His thumb hovered over the screen for a second. Then he pressed call. As the phone began ringing, a strange silence settled over the crowd. Nobody knew who Burke was calling. Nobody knew why. But every instinct told them the answer was about to change everything. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Crisp. Professional. The kind of voice that belonged to someone accustomed to carrying responsibility. Headquarters operations. Mason Burke stepped farther away from the crowd. "Gunnery Sergeant Mason Burke, Marine Corps Training Command. I need assistance identifying a retired Marine." A brief pause followed. "Name?" Burke glanced toward Thomas Walker. The old veteran remained exactly where he had been all afternoon, standing beneath the bright Virginia sky, while dozens of cadets and instructors watched him. "Thomas Walker." Silence. Not static. Not a bad connection. Silence. Burke checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Then the voice returned, lower than before. "Repeat the name." Burke felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. "Thomas Walker." Another silence. Longer this time. Around the training grounds, normal activity continued. Recruits crossed distant fields. Vehicles moved along service roads. Yet inside the circle surrounding Thomas, time seemed frozen. Nathan Reed noticed Burke's expression changing. The gunnery sergeant's posture had become rigid, focused, careful, as though every word suddenly mattered. Finally, the voice returned. "Do not disconnect." The line went quiet again. Burke waited. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. Nathan approached cautiously. "Gunny, what is happening?" Burke raised a hand without looking at him. "Not now." Nathan stopped immediately. The response alone told him everything he needed to know. Whatever was happening on that phone call was serious. Very serious. Another minute passed. Then a different voice appeared on the line. Older. Sharper. "This is Colonel James Mercer." Explain the situation. Burke quickly summarized the events. The unidentified veteran. The notebook. The photograph. The retired reconnaissance insignia. The restricted archive reference. The colonel listened without interruption. When Burke finished, the line remained silent for several seconds. Then came a question. "Is Mr. Walker currently being detained?" Burke looked toward Nathan. Several cadets immediately avoided eye contact. "No, sir." "Good." The colonel's answer came instantly. "Ensure it stays that way." Burke swallowed. "Sir, who exactly is he?" The colonel exhaled slowly. "That information is not available to you." Burke expected that. What he did not expect was what came next. "However, you are to extend every professional courtesy immediately." Burke stared at the phone. "Sir, you heard me, gunnery sergeant." The colonel's voice hardened. "And listen carefully. Nobody is to question him further. Nobody is to search additional belongings. Nobody is to interfere with him in any way." Nathan heard enough to catch fragments of the conversation. His stomach tightened. The confidence he had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Doubt. Across the field, Thomas Walker remained motionless. The breeze stirred his gray hair. His attention rested on the distant horizon as though he had seen this exact sequence unfold many times before. Burke lowered his voice. "Sir, should I notify the base commander?" "Negative." Another pause followed. Then the colonel added 6 words that made Burke's pulse spike. "Someone else is already coming." The call ended. Burke lowered the phone slowly. The crowd watched him, waiting, wondering. Nathan stepped forward. "Who is coming?" Burke looked toward the old veteran standing beneath the afternoon sun. Then he spoke the only honest answer he had. Someone important enough that we should all be very careful what happens next. The waiting became its own kind of tension. Nobody returned to training. Nobody wanted to leave. The entire section of the base seemed suspended between questions and answers. Nathan Reed stood quietly now, the earlier certainty gone from his posture. Around him, the other cadets avoided unnecessary conversation. Even the instructors had stopped pretending this was a normal afternoon. Mason Burke remained near Thomas Walker, watching the old veteran with growing respect. What struck him most was not the mystery surrounding the man. It was the complete absence of ego. Thomas had never demanded recognition, never raised his voice, never tried to explain who he was. He simply stood there beneath the bright sky as though the attention surrounding him belonged to somebody else. Then a distant sound rolled across the base. At first it was barely noticeable, a low rhythmic pulse carried by the wind. Several heads turned toward the horizon. The sound grew louder. Rotors. A helicopter. Nathan followed the noise toward the southern edge of the installation. Aircraft visited the base every day. Yet something about this arrival felt different. The helicopter appeared moments later, emerging above the tree line. Dark green. Fast. Purposeful. It did not approach the main landing zone. Instead, it angled directly toward the training complex. Conversations stopped completely. The aircraft descended toward an open field less than 300 yards away. Dust spiraled upward as the rotors pushed air across the ground. Cadets shielded their eyes. Instructors exchanged puzzled looks. Nobody had scheduled a visit. Nobody had announced an inspection. Yet the helicopter had arrived with unmistakable authority. As the aircraft settled onto the field, a black SUV appeared from another direction, racing toward the landing area. Then a second vehicle followed. Base personnel began moving quickly. Radios came alive. Nathan stared in disbelief. "What is happening?" he asked quietly. Mason Burke never took his eyes off the helicopter. "I think we are about to find out." The side door opened. A uniformed aide stepped out first. Then another. Both moved with practiced efficiency. Moments later, a tall figure emerged behind them. The reaction was immediate. Several instructors snapped to attention before they even realized they were doing it. Burke felt his stomach drop. He recognized the officer instantly. Everyone did. General Robert Kane. For stars gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. The commanding presence was unmistakable even from a distance. Nathan felt the color drain from his face. A four-star general had not arrived at a remote training field for a routine visit. Not without notice. Not without preparation. Yet Kane was already moving across the field with long, deliberate strides. His eyes were fixed in only one direction, toward Thomas Walker. Nothing else seemed to matter. Not the cadets. Not the instructors. Not the waiting vehicles. As the distance closed, an uneasy silence settled over everyone present. Nathan watched the approaching general, then looked toward Thomas. The old veteran had finally moved. Not much, just enough to straighten slightly. The faintest hint of recognition appeared in his eyes. For the first time all day, Thomas seemed interested in what was happening. General Kane continued forward without slowing. And in that moment, every person standing on the training grounds realized the same thing. Whatever they thought they knew about Thomas Walker had only scratched the surface. General Robert Kane crossed the remaining distance without hesitation. The crowd parted instinctively. Instructors stepped aside. Cadets straightened. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the fading rotors of the helicopter and the steady wind moving across the training grounds. Nathan Reed felt his heart pounding. He had seen four-star generals before, but never like this. Never walking directly toward a single individual with such focus. Kane stopped a few feet in front of Thomas Walker. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other. Decades seemed to pass between them in silence. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, General Kane came to attention. Perfectly, sharply, without hesitation. The entire field froze. Nathan could hardly believe what he was seeing. A four-star general stood before the quiet old veteran with a level of respect normally reserved for the most honored figures in military history. Kane raised his hand in salute. Thomas looked at him for a moment before returning the gesture with calm dignity. The silence that followed felt enormous. No one moved. No one breathed. Finally, Kane lowered his hand. His voice carried clearly across the field. "Good afternoon, sir." Thomas smiled faintly. It has been a long time, Robert. Hearing the general addressed by his first name sent another wave of shock through the crowd. Nathan felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood. Kane nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Far too long. He turned toward the assembled cadets and instructors. His expression remained calm, but his eyes were unmistakably serious. You deserve an explanation. Every person present listened. Many years ago, Kane began. Before any of you were born, I was a very young lieutenant assigned to a reconnaissance operation that went terribly wrong. I was inexperienced, overconfident, certain that training had prepared me for everything. He glanced briefly toward Thomas. I was wrong. The wind tugged at his uniform as he continued. The reason I am standing here today, the reason I was able to build a career, raise a family, and eventually wear these 4 stars, is because one Marine refused to abandon the people under his responsibility. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted their weight. That Marine was Thomas Walker. Nathan stared at the old veteran, the quiet man carrying the worn notebook, the man everyone had questioned, the man who never once tried to defend himself. King continued, History remembers medals. History remembers ranks. Sometimes history even remembers battles. But the people who truly shape lives are often forgotten. Thomas Walker never cared about recognition. He never asked for it. Yet generations of Marines have benefited from lessons, decisions, and sacrifices that trace back to him. Kane stepped closer to Thomas. Everything I became started with an example he set. For the first time all afternoon, emotion flickered across the general's face. I have spent years hoping I would get another chance to thank him properly. The training field remained utterly silent. Nathan lowered his eyes. The memory of his own actions felt heavier with every passing second. Thomas noticed. Look at me, son. Nathan obeyed. The old veteran's expression held no anger, no resentment. You were trying to do your job. Nathan swallowed hard. Sir, I am sorry. Thomas nodded once. Then learn from it. The answer was simple, direct, final. Kane looked across the formation. Cadets, remember this day. Respect is not earned through volume. It is not earned through rank alone. Sometimes the most extraordinary person in the room is the one saying the least. The afternoon sun dipped lower toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the field. One by one, the cadets came to attention. Then the instructors. Then everyone present. Not because they were ordered to, because they wanted to. Thomas Walker stood quietly among them, exactly as he had all day. The difference was that now everyone finally understood who was standing in front of them. And in the deep stillness that followed, a forgotten legend received the only recognition he had ever truly valued: respect.